Between 1866 and 1939, there had been a number of forest fires in that area. Our files contained all the information I needed. My proposal was to find ways of setting fire to the 400 miles of forest front, particularly in the area between Görlitz and Guben. Pine forests were ideal, especially after a long period of drought. This, and a minimum wind force of 4, might be expected late in April or in August, while the combination of pine forest and the appropriate conditions was not at all likely to be found in southern or northern Germany, so the Russians could not retaliate in kind. I explained, "Every major forest fire has shown that once it really gets going, it is impossible to stop even with enormous firefighting effort." I proposed, to achieve our object of annihilating the enemy's equipment and personnel, the fires must be started in such a way that the enemy has no chance of escape, a ring of fire. My branch calculated that fires like these could be started with relatively modest means, some 360 sorties by FW-190 fighter bombers, releasing incendiaries along a 100-mile line. I asked for an order from the Führer to prepare for such an operation, but that was the last I ever heard of it. Another opportunity for stemming the Soviet invasion occurred when we examined air reconnaissance reports, which showed that only 4 railroad bridges crossing the river Vistula from east to west were still intact. On March 24th, I advised Göring's operations staff, Luftwaffe attack on Vistula bridges at Krakow, Deblin, Warsaw and Thorn is urgently needed. Enemy supplies for Neisse and Oder fronts dependent on the bridges at Warsaw and Thorn. On the 26th, General Kohler, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, put this proposal to Hitler, but only reluctantly, for the special aircraft that would be needed had been earmarked for an ambitious plan for a strategic air attack on the entire Western Soviet electricity supply. Hitler decided, "In that case I would prefer to dispense for the time being with the attack on the Vistula bridges. They can be done later." In desperation, I called the attention of the SS who controlled the sabotage units operating behind Russian lines to the 4 bridges. "Their destruction or damage would bring very real relief to our troops," I cabled them. The reply reached me the next day. "Planning one of the bridges listed is in hand. Execution of operation depends on fuel allocation, aircraft allocation, and various personnel matters." I see I wrote on this reply, "That means we can't expect any action for the next 6 months." The Vistula bridges were still intact when the great final Soviet offensive on Berlin started a few days later. There could be no doubt as to what faced Germany. From one of our intelligence units, we obtained a report on a leaflet handed to every Red Army soldier which contained Stalin's Order No. 5, instructing that the German people were to be annihilated, all German factories and property to be destroyed, and the German beast stamped out in its kennels. On the Western Front, a copy of the Allied plan for post-war Germany, a brown-covered, inch-thick folder with the code name Eclipse, fell into our hands. To our amazement, the partition that was proposed for post-war Germany made Berlin a 4-power enclave in the heart of a Russian-controlled zone, and Thuringia, where I had believed our precious Foreign Armies East archives were safe from the Russian invasion, was clearly assigned to the Soviet Union. In what was to prove my final intelligence digest, early in April, I indicated that the impending loss of both Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, and Vienna would release fresh Russian strength against us, and that massive troop reinforcements were pouring into the area between Kustrin and Frankfurt an der Oder for the final assault on Berlin. The digest was put before Hitler by Guderian's successor, the infantry general Krebs. Hitler dismissed it as absolutely idiotic and defeatist, and on April 9th I was relieved of my position as head of Foreign Armies East. Lieutenant Colonel Wessel succeeded me as acting head. Meanwhile, I had ordered my family and the files of Foreign Armies East evacuated from Thuringia. They were loaded aboard 2 trucks, and the documents were brought out of their hiding place in the wine cellars at Naumburg and loaded up too. Near Leuna, the 2 trucks ran into an air raid, but they fortunately escaped damage. Later that night, near Hof, they were halted by an SS unit and forced into a nearby SS barracks for their load and papers to be examined. Under the circumstances, this exposed them all to a danger hardly less acute than the one they had so recently escaped in the air raid on Leuna. But the two skillful drivers, including Lieutenant Baun, the son of our frontline intelligence section's chief, were on their toes. They found a second gate unlocked at the rear of the barracks, and through this they drove the two trucks out and all escaped. My family found temporary accommodations in an industrialist's country house at Cham, a provincial capital near the Czech border in the Bavarian forest. The truckloads of secret files and documents continued southward in safety to Berchtesgaden and nearby Reichenhall, where part of Foreign Armies East was waiting for them. It was at this country house, Gutmanning, that my wife and I celebrated her 41st birthday on April 17th with a modest party appropriate to the grim circumstances. I invited all my former colleagues, officers and men, and a number of the female staff. During the first days of April, I had gone with Wessel to pay a private visit to Lieutenant Colonel Baun, controller of the WWII Organization, at Bad Elster, some 60 miles north of Cham. In the hotel there, I briefed Baun on my plans for the future. My view was that there would be a place even for Germany in a Europe rearmed for defense against communism. Therefore, we must set our sights on the Western powers and give ourselves two objectives: to help defend against communist expansion and to recover and reunify Germany's lost territories. The latter objective would of course find little acclaim from the victorious nations. But I felt that the common defense interests of the Western powers must inevitably lead them to recognize that without Germany all Europe was lost. This was why we could realistically expect them to show an interest in exploiting our intelligence service for espionage work in the East. Given the total defeat that was now approaching, it was probably utopian to entertain any notion of rebuilding the service immediately after the war ended, as the Allies would destroy every organization sponsored by the Third Reich. But the attempt was still worthwhile, so that someday a future German government could take the organization over, using our present staff as the expert nucleus. Of course, many questions arose. We could not know when a post-war German government would be set up, and it was questionable in April 1945 whether we could succeed in establishing with one of the three Western powers a working basis that would prove acceptable to a later German government. We could not work purely as mercenaries for a former enemy if we were not to burden the future intelligence service with the psychological stigma of having been a quisling organization. I therefore later tried to establish a degree of formal legality for our plans. In the last weeks of the war, I outlined the plans to General August Winter, Deputy Chief of the OKW's operations staff, and secured his blessing for them, since he was the only OKW authority I was able to reach. After the war, I chanced to meet Grand Admiral Dönitz in the prison camp at Wiesbaden. Dönitz was formerly Hitler's successor as head of state. He also approved my plans. During the Bad Elster stage in our planning, shortly before my dismissal, the question naturally arose which of the three Western powers would be the best partner for us. I discussed it at some length with my principal assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Wessel. Through Lieutenant Colonel Baun, using the channel to which I have referred earlier, we sent an offer of our future services to the British Secret Service. Baun received no acknowledgement, but from events in the Bavarian mountains some weeks later, we gathered that it had been received by the British. Taking everything into consideration, it seemed more expedient to make our approach to the American military forces. I suspected that once the shooting stopped, the Americans— Winter confirms this in a memorandum in the Gehlen Organization's files, dated July 18, 1952. In the conversation at Königssee near Berchtesgaden, I told him that one result of unconditional surrender would be that our priceless files on the Soviet Union might either fall into Russian hands or be destroyed or vanish into low-level Allied agencies which would not appreciate their value. Winter noted that I proposed withdrawing with these files and my top associates into the mountains until the hue and cry died down, before offering our services to the West, as in this way we would be serving our fatherland as best we could. For my part, I wholeheartedly approved of General Gehlen's proposals, would probably recover a sense of objectivity toward us more rapidly than their European allies, and subsequent history bore me out on this point. Baun was a first-class intelligence procurer who not only knew how to give his contacts worthwhile assignments and proper leadership, but looked after them properly as well. He worked mainly with Russian volunteers and was able to maintain contacts in the heart of Moscow until the very end. He agreed at once to make the necessary preparations as far as his networks were concerned, and I told him what I wanted. His adjutant took part in these discussions, but no other people were taken into our confidence. From early April 1945, his headquarters, Wally I, was in the Allgäu province, which was overrun by the Americans at the end of the month, and later occupied by the French. At the arrival of the Allied forces, Baun and his staff transferred in plain clothes to a pre-arranged rendezvous, while most of his intelligence workers went underground and waited to hear details of their future employment. He secured his files in a similar manner to those of foreign armies east, putting the most important files on microfilm and burying them or hiding them in various locations. During the last few weeks of the war, events came thick and fast, making our preparations no easier. On April 12th, my colleagues insisted on holding a small farewell party for me to mark my departure from foreign armies east. 3 years had passed since I had taken the branch over and started to build it up. It was a gloomy celebration, for nobody knew what now lay ahead of us. That our prognosis on the coming great conflict between East and West was shared by Moscow was shown by intelligence reports now reaching us. In mid-April, we learned that a group of Soviet agents had been parachuted behind our lines near Berlin on the night of the 7th, with instructions to prepare for the entry of Russian troops into Berlin on about the 20th. They also had the assignment of reconnoitering British and American preparations for attacking the Russians, and they were particularly instructed. In the event that Berlin is captured by the British and Americans, the agents are to destroy all their papers, but on no account identify themselves as agents. The implications were obvious, and they spoke even more loudly from the statements of a Russian prisoner captured southwest of Kustrin on the eve of the final attack against Berlin, led by Marshals Konev and Zhukov on April 16th. Big offensive will begin on April 16th at latest. Artillery bombardment first, 300 or 400 rounds per gun. Attack with 100 tanks per regiment. Prisoner speaks of new assault tanks with 180mm gun and of new 180mm heavy mortars. Object of the offensive is to beat the Americans to the capture of Berlin. Russian officers anticipate clashes and offensive engagements with Americans. They will have to drench the Americans by accident with an artillery bombardment so that they get a taste of the Red Army's lash. Troops have been ordered to put their uniforms in order and wash and shave every day to give a cultivated impression. It was a depressing situation, but perhaps it was the very gravity of the hour that enabled my former staff and me to perceive that whatever fate might hold in store for us, we would try to remain together and work in harmony as we always had in the past. In mid-April, I began my own preparations. I scouted around for suitable hideouts in the Bavarian mountains and supervised the microfilming and burying of the branch's files. The whole branch reassembled at Reichenhall in full working order, with the exception of a small group under Major Scheiber, which had been detached to the northern command staff of the OKW in Holstein, near the Danish border. In view of my dismissal, there was one minor snag to be overcome. I had earlier expressed to the Director of Army Personnel, General Bergdorf, a desire to command a combat division, and he now assumed that that was still my ambition. I asked him to post me instead to the General's Reserve, to enable me to train my successor, Colonel Wessel. I also claimed that Heinrich Himmler had a special job for me. Since Bergdorf was a pious Nazi, my claim sufficed, and he released me to the General's Reserve in the War Department. To give substance to my claim, I telephoned Schellenberg and asked him if Himmler would be interested in a detailed study of the rise and fall of the Polish underground resistance, to see if we could learn anything from the Polish experience that might be of use to us in the ordeal we might well be about to face. Schellenberg phoned me back not long afterward to confirm that this was a subject which would particularly interest Himmler. Over the next 8 days, I completed on the basis of our documents a very bulky study on the Polish resistance. I concluded that there was no point whatever in Germany's adopting similar underground methods if we were defeated or reached armistice with our enemies. Major Heymans agreed to drive to northern Germany to deliver the document to Schellenberg for Himmler. I drove with him as far as Cham so that I could see my wife and children, who had been joined by Frau Heymans. Then I returned to Reichenhall. As it turned out, I was not to see my family again until July 1946, and much would have happened to me before then. On April 28, 1945, our odyssey began. We buried our documents in scattered locations near the Wendelstein mountain, in Allgäu province, and at Hunsrück. Since we correctly assumed that we could not prevent some of the hiding places from being unearthed, we tried to duplicate the caches as far as possible, so that we would have at least one set of everything at our disposal when we came to set up shop again. We arranged to split up into 3 groups, which were to hide in the Alps until the hue and cry accompanying the end of the war died down. Perhaps 3 weeks. These groups would then report to the nearest American unit and go into captivity. Since the Americans would probably try to capitalize on our expert intelligence workers, each group was instructed to refuse any kind of cooperation until they had been shown written orders to that effect signed by me. I detailed one of our reserve officers, Chief Forester Weck, to find and prepare 3 hideouts in the Alps mountain huts, which were to be hard to find, but easy to reach with provisions and with a good supply of water. The huts were to be situated so that we had a good view of all roads of approach, but could escape unobserved if danger threatened. Weck did his work well, finding one hut near Fritz am Sand, not far from the village of Reit im Winkel, on the Austrian border. The second hut was Wild Moss Lodge, on the Wild Kaiser slopes, and the third was Elend Lodge, a corruption of the old German Odland Baron ground, near Lake Spitzing. I packed my belongings and left for the easternmost of our assembly points, the hut at Fritz am Sand. But hardly had I arrived when I learned that Himmler had issued orders for the liquidation of General Husinger and myself, so I decided prudence was the better part of valour, and moved to the westernmost hideout, the Elend Lodge, instead, as too many people had learned of my intention of hiding at the other. While I was on my way, I picked up a radio message from Baun, who had settled with his intelligence procurement section in the Allgäu. He asked me to rendezvous briefly with him at Hinderlang to give him further instructions. Instead of my usual Hoch automobile, I took an elderly DKW for the rendezvous on the other side of the mountains. My old staff officer from the Polish campaign, Captain G, accompanied me. As we drove up the mountain pass, we ran into retreating sections of one of our divisions which had been in combat. They had been heavily outnumbered by American forces as they tried to defend the mountain passes. It was fortunate that I had chosen the smaller car for, short though this stretch of highway was, it took time and effort to fight our way through the traffic jams. It was dawn before we reached the southern foothills of the mountains, and there our way was barred by the combat troops, who told us that the mountain highways were all blocked either by fighting or by demolished bridges. So we had to turn back without having established contact with Baun's group. It was on the return journey that I asked to be set down somewhere below the Elend Lodge, not far from the so-called Zipfelwärts, an inn right on the Austrian frontier. I left the road and climbed upward through a valley off to one side. The climb was tougher than I had expected. There was deep snow, and it was heavy going. Weck had warned me more than once that there were scattered SS units around the Elend Lodge, who had at one stage wanted to take over the hut themselves. That was why I considered it better to use this side valley for my approach. I must admit that had I known at the beginning how arduous it is to climb in snow without path or road, I would not have made the attempt. The climb took me many hours, or so it seemed, and as I climbed my thoughts circled endlessly around the events of the past few weeks and the uncertainty that lay ahead. My sober and doubting intellect reproached me, as I toiled my way upwards, that our enterprise could hardly be more utopian. But my resolve remained unshaken by this inward skepticism. These mental processes did, however, have the effect of passing the time during what had seemed at first an interminable ascent. I was finally redeemed by the sight of open snow ahead as the forest came to an end. A gently sloping snowscape unfolded ahead of me, in the middle of which nestled a large, low-roofed wooden hut, with broad eaves, a tall brick chimney and a veranda. This was the Elend Lodge, A wisp of smoke curling up out of the chimney informed me that it was occupied, and as I approached, I found my comrades and colleagues from the group I had dispatched to this hideout waiting for me. 6 officers and 3 of our female assistants. It was important for our plan that we should not be captured too soon. We had to bear in mind that despite the Americans' reluctance to climb into the mountains, they might still institute a search for us. On the other hand, we did not expect any search during the hours of darkness. So as dawn broke each day, one section of our group would climb higher into the mountains, while the 3 girls and the 2 younger officers who could not manage the difficult climb because of their injuries stayed below and kept guard on the lodge. We usually climbed to the Our Ridge and set up camp about a mile southeast of the Red Wall, in a terrain that was partially open and windswept, and partially covered by green forestation. We passed the days studying the countryside and rejoicing in the first signs of green shooting up gradually through the snows. Had we not been burdened with uncertainty about the future, had this not been May 1945, this mountain sojourn would have been a beautiful and idyllic respite, memorable for the stimulating conversations we conducted sitting in the sunshine as much as for anything else. I myself had known this country since 1921, when I had been at infantry school here and learned to ski on these slopes. As dusk fell each evening, we would set off down the mountain slopes again. Before we reached the Elend Lodge, we would check to make sure our comrades had hung out a tablecloth on the wash line as the signal that all was clear. A few days after the capitulation, 3 civilians appeared at the lodge during our absence, looking for me by name. We suspected that they were German-speaking members of the British Secret Service, a suspicion that was later confirmed. No doubt this was a result of the signal we had sent to London via Baun some weeks before. Somewhat less placid was the visit paid by a small American infantry unit, which carried out a textbook raid on the lodge, raking it with machine gun fire before storming it and searching it from top to bottom. They subjected the fortunately uninjured occupants to a thorough interrogation and took the 3 female staff and the 2 young officers with them down into the village, where they were put through a further grilling. They then asked their captives where they would like to be discharged to, and all asked to be permitted to stay at the Elend Lodge for the time being. When we returned that evening from our mountain encampment, we found the tablecloth on the line and our 5 loyal comrades waiting for us. They proudly showed us their discharge papers. From American captivity, bearing the provisional address, Elend Lodge. It was an unexpected stroke of good fortune, for it enabled us to keep at bay other people interested in requisitioning the hut for themselves. Chief Forester Weck acted as liaison man between us and the other groups. He had exchanged his Wehrmacht uniform for that of a forester, and was able to move about freely in consequence. Somewhat later in May, with the thawing of the snow and the warmer nights, we had to abandon our practice of leaving the hut each morning and returning in the evening, since the danger of being raided by night was now just as strong as by day. We set up a permanent camp of carefully camouflaged tents in a fir tree glade south of the Our Ridge, and here we passed another week of fine weather. These days of living in the arms of nature were truly enchanting. We had grown accustomed to the peace, and our ears were attuned to nature's every sound. Meanwhile, Weck had not been inactive either. From the forestry office he obtained the key to a secluded and almost inaccessible hut near the Marolschneid Ridge. It was so well hidden that despite the clearest directions it took us a long time to find it. The hut was at the crest of a steep rock face, densely surrounded by forestation on the other 3 sides, but with a magnificent view across the mountains. We enjoyed every minute of these last days of freedom to the full. The chamois which we encountered all about us were a particular delight, and they gradually lost all fear of us. By now it was the end of the 3rd week in May, and high time for us to put our plan into action. It was time to go down into the valley and report to the nearest American unit. The parents of one of our men, Major Schöler, lived at Fischhausen on Lake Schliersee. He suggested we spend the Whitsun holiday there and report next day to the Americans. We decided to make our way down from our hideout along the northern face of the Marolschneid Ridge, cross the Ruschen Heads, the Red Wall, and the Taubenstein slopes to the east of Lake Spitzing, and then follow the highway down to Fischhausen. We were to keep off the actual road and walk about halfway up the slopes west of it, through Neuhaus. It was important to stay as high up the slopes as we could, so as not to fall into the hands of one of the numerous patrols moving about lower down. We were determined not to be taken prisoner. We wanted to surrender on our own initiative to the Americans. It was all part of the plan. Under other circumstances, our mountain trek would have been an unforgettable and wonderful experience, but for us, this was still almost war. The evening before, we had stripped off our badges of rank and exchanged our red-striped trouser symbol of the General Staff for others, so now we were heading like countless other stragglers in a generally westward direction. The view from the Taubenstein mountain, which all 5 of us, the 2 injured officers, were left behind, reached together, was superb. Then we split up and set off again at 10-minute intervals. Near the lower Schönfeld Alp there was a French mountain unit. We could see them through our binoculars. We had no choice but to cross this valley if we were not to spend the night on the bare mountain. But the little French unit was lying there at ease, its mules grazing and the soldiers scattered among the dozen or so houses. As I approached the houses, a window opened and a somewhat curious French mountain infantryman looked out. I walked steadily on, greeted him with a bonjour, monsieur, and went past him. He returned my salutation and closed the window, evidently satisfied. Soon after, we passed the northern end of Lake Spitzing, not far from the mountain railroad station. Here, too, we had to take care, for the road was frequented by American jeeps and military police patrols. By evening, we were safe in the house of Major Schoeler's parents at Fischhausen. 3 days later, we would be in the hands of the American Intelligence Service, and 3 months hence, we would be in an American DC-3, flying the Atlantic to Washington. A week after we sailed from the United States, our Liberty ship berthed at Le Havre in northwestern France. It was July 1946. In Nuremberg, the war crimes trial was coming to an end. Europe was swept by hunger and devastation, and the Cold War was just beginning between East and West. Captain Eric Waldman, who had arrived at the G2 section from Washington in June, was waiting for us at dockside, and got my small group off the boat even before the American soldiers were able to disembark. We were driven in a number of cars to Orly Airport outside Paris. I went in a US Army reconnaissance car alone with Waldman, who briefed me about everything that had happened at G2 that would be of consequence for the implementation of our combined intelligence project. From Orly, we were flown to Frankfurt in a special plane. Our new home was to be at Oberursel, which had become famous as a Luftwaffe interrogation center during the war. The chief of US Vets G2, Brigadier General Edwin Siebert, was now using the compound for the same purpose. For the time being, we were regarded as a study group. 3 houses in the compound were placed at our disposal. They served as both office and living quarters. The American liaison team, consisting of Captain Waldman and a new arrival, Lieutenant Colonel John Dean, was housed separately in a 4th building, the so-called Blue House. A few days later, we also saw Captain John Boker again, who had returned to a staff post at US Army European Theatre. A formality came first. We were discharged from prisoner of war status so that we could move around at will, bound only by the need to return to our place of employment. The first few days were taken up with conferences with the 2 American officers on the question of how best to organize our work and how American and German aims could best be reconciled. The American Colonel William Russell Philp, who was now in command of Oberursel, would supervise the work and furnish logistic support. There was never any suggestion that this should be an all-American affair, nor that I was in any way betraying Germany in dealing with the forces of occupation. It may seem now of purely academic interest, but this was precisely why, before leaving Germany, I had secured the formal approval of General Winter and Admiral Donitz for my future collaboration with the Americans in the interests of Germany. The cluster of houses in which we worked was surrounded by barbed wire, but this time it really was for our protection, to keep out unwanted visitors. The American zone was overrun by Russians, probing around for all sorts of reasons. General Eisenhower had adopted a lenient attitude toward this, hoping, in vain, for some kind of reciprocity from them. An added advantage of the barbed wire was that it made our section look like part of the main Oberursel prison camp, in which there was the most motley collection of mainly political prisoners. It was excellent camouflage and did not depress us in the least. I was able to see my wife and children again after a year's separation, and my staff were also able to see theirs. Soon after our arrival, General Siebert came to see us. He was now the military intelligence chief on the staff of the Commander of United States Forces in the European theatre, and one of the few senior Americans to have seen the coming East-West conflict from the outset. He was a man of great moral courage, and this deserves to be recognized. He had been the target of a lot of ill-informed criticism for having failed to detect Hitler's preparations for the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. I have always held that no logic could have indicated that a sane military leader would commit 35 divisions in the manner Hitler did that winter. Now that Siebert agreed to take my organization, under his wing, he said to us in effect, "If anything goes wrong, God help all of you." Siebert and I went over every aspect of the new organization. He fully understood why I felt bound to impose certain conditions on our cooperating with the Americans. As far as the political ambitions of the communist bloc looming in the East were concerned, Americans and Germans were now sitting in the same boat, and we had to think in terms of a common defense effort. This, if nothing else, justified our working together. It was for the diplomats and politicians to attend to the rest. There was no escaping the future as we saw it, and the events of the last 25 years have confirmed that we were right. I had gone over much the same ground in my very first talks with Captain Boker at Wiesbaden and with the authorities in Washington, and yet again in the negotiations with the American liaison team here at Oberursel, so my remarks cannot have been much of a novelty for General Siebert, though I dare say I put them to him in a pithier form than the summaries he had received. My later discussions with General Siebert in Oberursel ended with a gentleman's agreement, which for a variety of reasons we never set down in black and white. Such was the element of trust that had been built up between the two sides during this year of intensive personal contact that neither had the slightest hesitation in founding the entire operation on a verbal agreement and a handshake. This unconditional trust was absolutely crucial to our success in the years that followed. I remember the terms of the agreement well. 1. A clandestine German intelligence organization was to be set up, using the existing potential to continue information gathering in the East, just as we had been doing before. The basis for this was our common interest in a defense against communism. 2. This German organization was to work not for or under the Americans, but jointly with the Americans. 3. The organization would operate exclusively under German leadership, which would receive its directives and assignments from the Americans until a new government was established in Germany. 4. The organization was to be financed by the Americans with funds which were not to be part of the occupation costs, and in return the organization would supply all its intelligence reports to the Americans. 5. As soon as a sovereign German government was established, that government should decide whether the organization should continue to function or not, but that until such time, the care and control, later referred to as the trusteeship, of the organization should remain in American hands. 6. Should the organization at any time find itself in a position where American and German interests diverged, it was accepted that the organization would consider the interests of Germany first. The last of the 6 points may raise some eyebrows, since it might seem that the American representatives had gone overboard in making concessions to us. But this point demonstrates better than any other Siebert's great vision. He recognized that for many years to come, the interests of the United States and West Germany must run parallel. This was the key to our success, that from the start we had concluded an agreement that was strong enough to withstand all the difficulties and problems that were to beset it in the years that followed. I stand in admiration of Siebert as a general who took this bold step, in a situation fraught with political pitfalls, of taking over the intelligence experts of a former enemy for his own. Country. It was very much to the credit of everybody concerned with our trusteeship on the American side that they were able to find the right psychological basis and climate of mutual trust for this unique venture to be launched. The political risk to which Siebert was exposed was very great. Anti-German feeling was running high, and he had created our organization without any authority from Washington and without the knowledge of the War Department. I understand that he informed his opposite number in the British zone, Major General Sir Kenneth Strong, of our existence, but he asked him not to inquire too closely into the matter for fear that the press might discover our activities. Those of my former officers who stayed behind in Europe had not been idle in the months before my return from the United States. Shortly after my flight to Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Wessel established contact with Hermann Baun, who had been through much the same as we. He had surrendered to the Americans, as we had arranged in our discussion in the empty hotel at Bad Elster a month before the war ended. He had also been shipped back and forth across Germany, finally ending up not far from Wiesbaden, in the CIC interrogation centre at Oberursel. The regime there was very strict, as the centre also housed a number of suspected war criminals for interrogation purposes. Baun bore with this situation, as did his colleagues, displaying a characteristically grim humour, and eventually he told the CIC he was willing to work for them as we had arranged. I have already described in the prologue to these memoirs how during my talks in Washington at the end of 1945 I had agreed to the resumption of active operations on a trial basis by Baun and our other former colleagues left in Germany. Two considerations had been uppermost in my mind at the time. First, we had to convince the justifiably skeptical Americans that, apart from our document files, which the natural process of obsolescence would render valueless in time, we could offer them other intelligence of a topical and worthwhile nature, which would be all the more impressive in a Germany torn by chaos, her communications constricted by interzonal frontiers, and with millions of her citizens forced to migrate aimlessly the length and breadth of the nation. Second, the passage of time would make it harder with every week that passed to recruit the nucleus of workers we needed. Once they had been discharged from captivity and swallowed up into civilian life, we would probably never manage to find these experts again, given the prevailing conditions of catastrophe. Wessel learned from the Americans that I had agreed to a resumption of operations. Baun was put in the picture by the CIC at Oberursel. Unfortunately, neither Wessel nor I knew at the time that Baun had not been told the whole story by the CIC, as they had been kept in the dark as to my existence and the plans that evolved in Washington, and they remained in this state of ignorance until 1949. We later found out that Baun had proposed his own plans for a practical intelligence operation to the Americans. His proposed organization was not dissimilar to Admiral Canaris's Abwehr between 1933 and 1941. What he wanted was an independent intelligence procurement agency under his leadership, which would work as and where he saw fit, handing over its information to a totally independent second agency for analysis and evaluation. This was in flat contradiction to the plans that had been approved in Washington, and I certainly could not have supported him, if only because it would have made it easy for the Americans to play off one agency against the other. And as much as I valued Baun's experience, there would be no guarantee that the Americans would be passed only such information as I would personally be willing to take responsibility for. My own experience of certain Abwehr reports during the war made me very uneasy in this respect. The existence of two parallel organizations would also prove an unnecessary complication when the time came for a new German government to take us over, quite apart from the fact that it was this biaxial structure that had yielded such a large and damaging crop of command errors during the war. Nor did the Baun plan reflect the way the American authorities in Europe envisaged our work. They showed a marked preference to deal with me after my stay in Washington was over. While Washington had, after protracted negotiations, given its general agreement to our starting work, the actual terms of this joint operation remained a matter for General Siebert. His was the head that would roll if the experiment went wrong, or if there was a political scandal. This was another reason why he and his colleagues preferred to work with one German, who would take responsibility for the whole operation, and who was, moreover, the senior ranking officer of the former Foreign Armies East Staff. A further factor was that to the Americans, Baun was a man of complex personality. He had been born in Odessa and had spent the formative years of his childhood there before his family returned to Germany. He had grown up bilingual and had absorbed the Russian mentality. Asked with so many other foreign-born Germans who had spent years in Russia, there was something of the Russian soul in him, that emotional, sentimental, and immeasurable something that distinguishes the Russians from other peoples. But the other side of this attractive coin was his extravagant and uncontrollable imagination, which made it hard for him to pass sober judgment on hard facts, and which caused him to waste too much time chasing will-o'-the-wisps. This, and his years under Canaris and the Abwehr, put a natural barrier between him and the Americans who had to deal with him, and inevitably roused certain misgivings in them, which were sometimes not entirely justified. It was largely because the CIC had not been able to put Baun fully in the picture that when we came to discuss our detailed organization plans in August 1946, Baun was reluctant to subordinate himself wholeheartedly to me, even though the outline of our future joint effort with the American Army had been broadly mapped out by then. I was planning to put Baun in charge of my espionage section and Wessel in charge of the analysis section. Had the proper degree of frankness been displayed to Baun by the Americans, it would doubtless have spared us much of the later unpleasantness that arose. Of course, it cannot be ruled out that the Americans may have considered it in their interests initially to have two irons in the fire, given the somewhat obscure situations at that time. And there were certainly some officers in US Army's G2 branch who were less enthusiastic about identifying themselves with the joint operation than Colonel Philp, Captain Boker, and Captain Waldman. The fact that we did not secure a formal agreement with the American Secret Service, by then the CIA, until much later shows just how unstable the situation was, despite the goodwill shown by both sides. The difficulties facing Wessel and Baun early in 1946, when they had first started their attempts to rebuild an intelligence organization, were largely the result of the post-war chaos in Europe. But the remarkable feature was that not one of those whom they approached to act in one capacity or another for them let them down. Although virtually every German refugee from the East had lost everything he possessed, again and again over the years we found among these homeless expellees people who were willing to risk everything for us, even if they had in the meantime found other employment. It made no difference what their personal politics were. There were allegations that it was this loss of livelihood and property that made working for us attractive, and that the organization we were building up was nothing more than a bunch of desperados and adventurers joined together to learn a new and murky trade. This kind of accusation was repeatedly leveled at us by communist propaganda from the Soviet zone until about 1954, and in some cases it was even picked up by the mass media of the West. The truth was that we had nothing of value in the ordinary sense that we could offer our workers in return. Our existence was a closely guarded secret. To be successful and guard against infiltration by the enemy, we had to remain a secret too. So our typical worker's return to normal life as a regular citizen was blighted from the start. For security reasons, he could not mention his work to his relatives. He had no government protection, because the German state as such had ceased to exist, and the protection the occupation authorities could offer him was less than marginal. The jurisdiction of the United States authorities was restricted to their own zone, even after the economic fusion of this with the British zone and the formation of the bizone late in 1946. On top of this, initially only G2 section knew of our existence, a state of affairs we wanted to last as long as possible. So for a long time our operatives were at the mercy of the ultra-suspicious organs of other American security agencies, particularly the ever-watchful CIC and the military police. Many are the songs we could sing on that score. The pay was meagre, my own salary being only about 1,200 marks a month in 1952. In the years before the West German currency reform of June 1948, our working capital was in the form of US dollars, at first sight well worth having, but in fact bound up with innumerable difficulties for us. For example, we were not allowed to cash dollars at banks in order to avoid having to answer awkward questions about where they came from, so we had to try and change them with the assistance of our American friends, Otherwise, we could not have obtained the German currency to keep the organization on its feet. In short, it took a lot of idealism after 6 years of war, captivity, expulsion, and the many other personal privations from which no German had been spared, for any man to agree to work for us. And in some cases it was even picked up by the mass media of the West. The truth was that we had nothing of value in the ordinary sense that we could offer our workers in return. Our existence was a closely guarded secret. To be successful and guard against infiltration by the enemy, we had to remain a secret too. So our typical worker's return to normal life as a regular citizen was blighted from the start. For security reasons, he could not mention his work to his relatives. He had no government protection, because the German state as such had ceased to exist, and the protection the occupation authorities could offer him was less than marginal. The jurisdiction of the United States authorities was restricted to their own zone, even after the economic fusion of this with the British zone and the formation of the Bi-Zone late in 1946. On top of this, initially, only US VET's G2 section knew of our existence, a state of affairs we wanted to last as long as possible. So for a long time, our operatives were at the mercy of the ultra-suspicious organs of other American security agencies, particularly the ever-watchful CIC and the military police. Many are the songs we could sing on that score. The pay was meagre, my own salary being only about 1,200 marks a month in 1952. In the years before the West German currency reform of June 1948, our working capital was in the form of US dollars, at first sight well worth having, but in fact bound up with innumerable difficulties for us. For example, we were not allowed to cash dollars at banks, in order to avoid having to answer awkward questions about where they came from. So we had to try and change them with the assistance of our American friends. Otherwise, we could not have obtained the German currency to keep the organization on its feet. In short, it took a lot of idealism after 6 years of war, captivity, expulsion, and the many other personal privations from which no German had been spared, for any man to agree to work for us. The first trial intelligence procurement operations had started early in April 1946, and the results had met with the Americans' approval. We were not able to awaken some of our agents in the Soviet Union who had become dormant with the end of the war, and in fact the original network was to play a smaller part in our rebirth than has been suggested in some publications. Baun made a start in that direction, but I felt it was better to concentrate on recruiting fresh agents while we could, as we could not be sure which of the old ones had been won over by the Russians. Those that we could trust were awakened by prearranged signals, but in the state of disorder existing in post-war Europe, it was comparatively easy for our people to be sent deep into the Soviet Union to establish personal contact. Of far greater value, however, were the files and indices we had maintained on the Russian military units. Meanwhile, after the July 1946 conference with General Seibert had resulted in the gentleman's agreement referred to above, espionage operations proper had begun. Our first requirement was the creation of a small but efficient brain for the organization, followed by a somewhat larger operations staff to control the espionage work and a reliable analytical section. This vital spadework took up much of our time, eager though we all were to get started, since we lacked many of the things we needed. We had little space to work in, no technical equipment such as radio transmitters and receivers, and we urgently needed a larger staff. But we had lost contact with many of those who had been working on intelligence during the war. We also had to recruit enough clerical personnel for our purposes. But beginning again from scratch like this did have its advantages. It is far harder to take over a large existing organization and try to convert it and modernize it than to create one from nothing, benefiting from all the experience gained in the past. Wessel and I wanted only one thing, to form a nucleus for a single future German intelligence service that would profit from all we had learned from the services we had witnessed or worked in during the war and pre-war years. Where there is a multiplicity of foreign intelligence services, there can only be rivalry, overlapping, and security risks, for they offer the enemy's intelligence organs ideal opportunities for penetrating them from within. I therefore planned to use the years that followed until a new German government came into being in creating a uniform intelligence service capable of carrying out every kind of espionage work against the enemy. It would unite under one agency diplomatic intelligence, economic intelligence, military intelligence, and counter-espionage. Clearly, such an agency could only emerge in the future as a civilian body, if for no other reason than the sheer size of the task. Accordingly, we essayed to recruit high-grade civilian personnel in addition to the former army officers at our disposal. For example, we took on former members of the Foreign Service, former civil servants and the like, provided that they had had a clean slate in the Third Reich and had done nothing reprehensible since then. The speed with which we could set up the new organization was bound to depend on the space, funds, and equipment placed at our disposal. But to the Americans, we were still something of an experiment, so improvisation and makeshift characterized the first trial runs of the Gehlen Organization, as we soon came to be known to our friends. Despite this, we still had to show worthwhile intelligence results, if we could, to convince the Americans that there was a future in us. The original differences with Baun were settled, at least for the time being. In addition to getting him an efficient operations staff for his work on the intelligence procurement side, to speed up this inflow of reports, we had to find him accommodations near our organization's headquarters. We finally found room for him at an inn at Schmitten, 15 minutes by car from Oberursel, where we were. Our headquarters stayed in the Blue House cluster of buildings there. We initially accommodated our analytical section there too, but later on we removed it to Kransberg Castle, where there was room for it to expand later on. We soon established good relations with the American liaison team, Colonel Dean and Captain Waldman. It was Waldman who bore most of the brunt of the cooperation with us. I have already emphasized how much we owed to him. Even when his superiors showed little sympathy, he committed himself wholeheartedly to our cause, putting up with the personal disadvantages this involved him in without a murmur. Colonel Dean was an outstanding active service officer who had distinguished himself in combat but had had little to do with intelligence work for some time. A number of minor difficulties resulted from the colonel's lack of experience in intelligence affairs. When, for example, I tried to impress him with the need for us to obtain false identity cards, his first retort was an astonished, "That's against the law." It took some effort on my part to persuade him that it was not a true violation of the law, and that the use of fake identity cards is common practice in intelligence circles. After I had gradually succeeded in convincing him of certain other peculiarities of our trade, this trusty officer swung around to our side and threw the full weight of his personality behind us. Thus we gained a second mentor in addition to Waldman, and that is why I have always followed the later career of the colonel, who is now an influential general in the United States, with a particular sense of gratitude. More serious were the difficulties that arose during this period with Hermann Baun, whose concept of the organization remained very different from my own. He tended to regard our job purely from the intelligence procurement angle, and overlooked the political need to limit ourselves strictly to what we were capable of, and to what was desirable as well. Nonetheless, he attempted to carry out his own plans rather than mine, and this disinclination to accept the fact that I was in charge led to increasing friction. In April 1947, I therefore found it necessary to replace him as Chief of Intelligence Procurement, but since he had otherwise served me well, I put him in another responsible job. I did not elbow him out, as was subsequently claimed in various publications. His successor was Colonel Hans Dilberg, a loyal staff officer with great vision, particularly on the organizational side. He had picked up a lot of experience in a prominent position in intelligence procurement during the pre-war period, and later he had worked extensively in military intelligence as well. Under his expert management, our intelligence procurement advanced by leaps and bounds. It is difficult to describe the exceptional problems confronting us in 1947 and 1948. What is now the Federal Republic of West Germany was at that time occupied territory, partitioned into 3 zones, with all passenger and goods transport under strict Allied surveillance. Even on our own side of the demarcation lines, we had to operate under a cloak of conspiracy, which would scarcely have been possible without American aid. It was no rare occurrence for one of our workers to be seen acting suspiciously near the zonal border and to be arrested by the CIC or the British security forces. We then had to secure his release with the help of the American liaison team, but without disclosing his real job, no easy undertaking. Our officials setting out from Bavaria to our regional office, Außenstelle, in the American enclave at Bremerhaven in northern Germany, had to fill their cars with spare gas tanks, for if they ran out of gas on the way, they could expect no mercy from the British or French occupation authorities. Railroad connections were bad, telephone lines were indistinct and overloaded, and tapped by the Allies anyway. The economic situation was a catastrophe, but our organization was gradually expanding and its mouths had to be fed. It did not help matters that our operational bases were distributed across the entire length and breadth of Western Germany and had to be given realistic fronts as camouflage. Our workers were not able to give the authorities any information on their circumstances if they had to report in connection with personal affairs or family matters. Nor was it possible until our transfer to federal control in 1956 to register them in any state insurance program, as officially there was no employer, a headache that persisted for us long after we had been transferred to the West German government. Every piece of our equipment, from typewriters to radio transmitters, had to be supplied by the US Army. Here, too, there was a great danger of our being exposed, with all the undesirable consequences that would imply, so we often had to put up with long delays. The problems facing us in establishing links by courier, post and telephone across the Iron Curtain were equally formidable. That we succeeded in solving all these problems seems a miracle to me even now. We restricted our investigations at first to purely military questions. This was inevitable, as we had rebuilt our organization on the existing foundations of the forward reconnaissance units, Frontaufklärungseinheiten, we had used on the Eastern Front. It soon became clear, however, that along with the growing estrangement between the former Allies, the Americans' interest in purely political problems increased. By the end of 1946, we were already keeping an eye on political trends behind the Iron Curtain. From that, it was a logical progression to embrace espionage on communist economic affairs and arms technology as well. In this latter field, which the orthodox American services had begun to watch only comparatively recently, we were able to communicate particularly important results to them. My own concept of a uniform intelligence service, which I had based on the experiences assembled by Group 2, long-term appreciation studies, of foreign armies east during the war, was clearly right if these early results were anything to go by. In the autumn of 1947, we unfortunately lost both General Siebert and Colonel Dean. The latter was replaced by Colonel Lewis, who with the best will in the world failed to see eye to eye with us and unwittingly jeopardized the entire joint operation. He was a good soldier. Even as a full colonel, he still regularly practiced parachute jumps, but he regarded his as a position of command, with authority over us Germans too, an attitude totally at variance with the gentleman's agreement I had concluded with Siebert. He knew only one military relationship. He gave the orders and we had to obey them. It was a creed he had practiced his entire military life. We were servants of the US Army. Therefore we had to toe the line. His attitude caused a lot of friction. He was not the best of partners for myself, as head of an organization which had by then already expanded to a considerable size, employing several thousand men. I am sure he did his best to work in harmony with us.